So my name is Brad Forder. I'm director of programming for the festival. And to celebrate this year's 30th anniversary, we're bringing back highlights from past lineups. And one of those films is Bluebird Man. It was the winner of the 2016 Eric Moe Award for Best Short. And joining me is the subject of the film, Bluebird Man himself, Al Larson, as well as the co-director of the film, Matt Podolsky. Matt is a documentary filmmaker, podcaster, also co-founder of Wild Lens Collective. And since Bluebird Man, he's been a part of the festival with several other films. We'll talk about those in just a few minutes. Sea of Shadows being one as well that you've seen him in over the last couple of years at the festival. So first, I do feel like I'd be bearing the lead if I didn't bring this up. And Al, I understand that you have a birthday coming up. It's during our festival. It's March the 26th. So I just wanted to recognize that and start off by wishing you a happy birthday.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'll be 100.
Do you have any celebration plans?
Well, on my birthday, we'll be having an open house down in Meridian, Idaho. And people that I know will probably show up there.
I'm sure they will, Al. And so again, we're so glad you could join us. And again, a very happy birthday to you as well. We're so glad you can be here with us. So before we talk a little bit about the film, as I mentioned, this is the anniversary year. And throughout our planning, we've been reminiscing, looking back at old pictures. And I did come across this from 6 years ago. Al, one thing about that day as I was looking at the picture was I remembered your shirt, and it was a big hit, and it tells the story about your conservation work. You have your Audubon Society patch, you have your Idaho Bluebird button, and Idaho is where your story begins. So Al, remind us how you kind of became the Bluebird Man, how you were interested and became interested in bluebirds and conservation work as a citizen scientist.
Well, I think I mentioned it in the film that I was interested in photography, and I happened to be walking out in the hills with my wife one day and saw a pair of western bluebirds going into an old woodpecker hole. And I thought, well, if I could put some boxes up, maybe I have bluebirds show up and I could take some better pictures of them. So that got me started. And then on field trips for Audubon Society and other groups, I would run across a place where there was a group of bluebirds, mainly in the fall when they're gathering to migrate. And I think, well, this is a good place to put some boxes up too. And I just put boxes up to accommodate the birds without any thoughts in mind, environmental thoughts in mind. I just wanted to help the bluebirds. And well, as the story goes, I wound up with about 350 nest boxes out to check, and I checked them all myself. That is, I kept records on every one of them, and I got a banding license and I banded birds to see if I could find more about them. And I found out that some of the birds come back year after year in the same area, and some of them return to the same box that they were hatched out in or nested in before. And on one of the field trips, an instructor from Boise State University was on there, and she was impressed with the bluebirds and thought maybe she could get a class going at Boise State. And Neil was invited to come along on another field trip, and he got started, and and he got Matt Podolsky interested in it. And the first thing I know, they had a microphone strapped on me and had a camera stuck in my face. They must have taken thousands of pictures, and it wound up with the Bluebird program.
Well, and Matt, that was going to be my next question, was how you came together and met Al, and how the project started for you. So what were your first interactions with Al, and how did the film begin?
Sure, yeah. I mean, before I even met Al in person, as Al mentioned, he met my colleague and co-director of the film, Neil Paprocki, first through some connections at Boise State University. And yeah, before I had the opportunity to meet Al in person, I remember Neil coming back from this trip. He took a trip out onto one of Al's Bluebird trails with him, and just shot a few photos and got a few video clips. And I remember Neil coming back and showing me some of those photos and showing me a few video clips. I remember one of the clips that he showed me was a short clip of Al climbing up over this locked gate that he had to get over in order to access a whole bunch of the boxes. And I remember asking you, how old is this guy? How long has he been doing this? I was just amazed, by the passion, behind what he was doing. And I think the two of us right then were like, yeah, we need to make a documentary here. And then I think, Al, the first time we met was up at your house, up along Daggett Creek. And yeah, we just had, Al, you were so welcoming, you had never met me before. I know you had met Neil a couple of times, but you just welcomed us into your home, and we're very willing to let us point those cameras in your face. I think one of the things that I'll say, right, is that the film Bluebird Man, we, as Al mentioned, we spent a lot of time, out on Al's Bluebird trails with him and shot many, many hours of footage. But we also relied very heavily on Al's footage, right? And so, Al has been an amateur photographer, and he had film cameras that he was, and video cameras as well, that he has been capturing sort of moments with for a long time. And without that archive, without Al's footage itself, we wouldn't have been able to tell the story in that same way. So, Al should get a lot of credit for that as well.
Part of this program is also catching up with filmmakers and kind of asking them what they've been doing as well since we last saw them. And so talk a little bit about, over these last 6 years, what you've been up to, any projects you've been working on. As I mentioned, in 2020, we saw you virtually again with Sea of Shadows, which was another festival award winner. So just talk a little bit about what you've been up to since we last saw you.
Yeah, for sure. The sort of big project that took up quite a bit of my time, that I dove into after we finished working on Bluebird Man, was this big documentary project focused on the vaquita, and the sort of extinction crisis facing this small species of porpoise in the northernmost part of the Gulf of California in northwestern Mexico. And yeah, there were, that project, let's see, we first started taking trips down to Mexico to shoot footage for that project in 2015. And we released Sea of Shadows, as you mentioned, in 2019. So I was engrossed, excuse me, I was engrossed in that project for 4 years. And there were like multiple films that sort of emerged from that. I mean, I'm fairly certain we screened the short film, Souls of the Vermilion Sea, at the DC Environmental Film Festival as well. And the release of that film, I mean, we basically, that was a half-hour short. And we basically used that film to try to generate some additional interest, from funders and co-production partners, to produce a bigger film, a feature length film that we hoped could have a more substantial impact on the issue itself. And that film evolved into Sea of Shadows, which, as you mentioned, screened at the DC Environmental Film Festival in 2020. So yeah, that whole project was really like a whirlwind, right? I mean, both in as far as the content and the story that we were telling, which, as we dove deeper into that story, we started to realize that, we weren't just telling this story about conservation. We were telling this story about, illegal wildlife trafficking and organized crime and the Mexican drug cartels. And, I mean, we were down there with our big crew with Sea of Shadows. I mean, we had armed guards at the apartment we were staying, right? So, I mean, crazy. It was crazy stuff, right? I mean, yeah. And then also the film itself, the amount of exposure that we got for that story was amazing, right? Amazing to me. I mean, I think, I don't know. I wish it had more. I wish I could say that it had more of an impact on the outcome of the issue. I mean, unfortunately, like the vaquita is not extinct yet, which is actually amazing that there are still a few left, because the issues affecting them have not been resolved. And so this illegal fishing and the trafficking of the swim bladder of the Tatuaba, which is sort of the root cause behind the decline of the vaquita, because the vaquita are dying as bycatch in these nets set for the Tatuaba. That's still happening. And if anything, the effects of the pandemic exacerbated that. But there's still a handful of vaquita out there, which is amazing. Some of the biologists have this theory that I think is really fascinating, that like this tiny remnant population of like probably only 7 individuals may have actually learned to see the nets. And in Sea of Shadows, there's this brief scene where, part of the story in that film was telling the story behind this effort to bring the last remaining vaquita into captivity. And they were using nets very similar to the gill nets that are used to catch Tatuaba, except that there was a team of biologists right there, like ready to make sure that once the vaquita got entangled in the net, that it wasn't gonna die. They were there to provide care and get it into a safe captive environment. But we watched, and it's in the film, we have aerial footage of it, of a vaquita swimming right towards the net and then diving right underneath it, and it really looks like that animal saw the net, So there's interesting things happening for sure. But yeah, it's still a very unfortunate situation. But yeah, we Sea of Shadows, we premiered it at Sundance in 2019. I saw you there, Brad. And since then, I mean, then I had a bunch of plans for future projects, which are still ongoing. A lot of those plans were, affected by the pandemic. But I am producing a feature-length documentary about bats and bat conservation and white nose syndrome right now, which is this fungal blight that has been really severely affecting bat populations all across North America for the last 15 years. Mm-hmm. And COVID is sort of intertwined with that story, because we were following this team of bat researchers before the pandemic hit. And then we sort of document how the pandemic affected the work that they were doing. So it's sort of this story about, disease how disease impacts both, animal and human populations, and how it's intertwined with conservation issues.
And that was another question I had, was how you have been affected by the pandemic, as I know so many of our filmmakers have too.
Yeah, it's, we've found ways to adapt, right? I mean, for the bat documentary that I mentioned, we continued, all of our plans, all of our production trips for 2020 were canceled when the pandemic hit. But as the story changed, we realized okay, what's happening is a part of the story. And so we need to find ways to continue following our characters so that people can see how the pandemic is affecting them, because COVID-19 is intertwined with bat conservation, right? And so, we just started hiring remote crews, and our director, Kristen Tiesh, would, basically just have remote meetings with, a team that we would hire in a remote location, and they would just go out and get the footage, send it back to us. And that's kind of the process we've been operating under for the last couple of years. We have been able to get, Kristen has been able to get out on a handful of shoots, in person, as pandemic precautions have eased. But the switch to remote crews is a good thing for the industry, I think, right? There's definitely a silver lining here. And, I help run this organization, the Wildlands Collective. We really are just sort of this network of filmmakers, storytellers, folks who work in sort of media production, who are interested in conservation and environmental issues. We've got about 50 members, mostly in the US, but some international folks as well. And part of the idea is that we can all work together to minimize the environmental impact of the production process itself, right? And it doesn't always make sense to send a 5-person crew halfway across the world in order to get the footage that you need. Maybe you send one person, and you hire a local crew, or maybe you don't send anybody, as we were doing during the pandemic. And one of the interesting things that happens, is a whole bunch of our members of our collective started getting jobs from the BBC. The BBC never used to hire any outside people, and all of a sudden the pandemic hit, and it's oh, okay, we need to shoot a program in this location, so let's reach out to some filmmakers who live in that location and have them do it. So I think there's a benefit there. It's kind of a bummer for filmmakers like me. It's part of the reason we do it is because it's fun to travel, but we need to be thinking about the impact of the work that we do.
As you look back, what are some takeaways or lessons, or what are some things that you took away from the experience working with Al, telling his story also, that you've kind of kept with you as you've pursued these other projects?
I think that, I don't know. I think one of the core things that Bluebird Man and the whole process that we went through of producing the film and working with Al taught me is the power of a really compelling feel-good story. We produced Bluebird Man on a tiny, tiny budget. We were pulling we ran a very small crowdfunding campaign to raise some seed money. And, my co-director, Neil, and I we spent lots of volunteer hours, out with Al gathering footage. And, part of that was just we just had fun being out with Al on the Bluebird Trail, right? That was a big part of it. It was hey, we don't necessarily, there were many trips, right, where we were sort of oh, there's nothing really specific that we need, but we just want to be there with Al in case something happens, right? And there's a few scenes that ended up in the film that if we hadn't been doing that, we wouldn't have captured, those moments, right? There was a moment in the film where we were out with Al, and Al came across a box that had fallen off of the post, right? And he looked down on the ground, and there were all of these tiny little, probably 4 or 5 day old nestlings that had just fallen out of the opening of the box and were just laying on the grass. They were still alive. It had just happened hours ago, And if Al hadn't happened across that box, those tiny little nestlings were completely helpless. Like they certainly would have died. But Al was just able to pick it up, put the birds back in the box, and, screw it back up onto the post. And so moments like that, sort of resulted from that kind of approach. So anyways, yeah, I mean, I think like that's part of it as well, is like just finding those opportunities and just like being present and not always being like, oh, okay, I have to get this shot or I have to get this shot, but just like, just being present for as much as possible and like looking for moments like that. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, like we were just blown away by, I guess, the reaction that we got from the film. I mean, we saw it as like a very sort of local story. When we launched it, we went and chatted with the folks from our local PBS affiliate station, Idaho Public Television. And we were sort of like, we want to do our premiere on this local PBS affiliate. Like, this is a local Idaho story. And it just snowballed from there, as far as like festivals and winning this award at the DC Environmental Film Festival was a huge part of that. We ultimately got a national PBS broadcast as a part of the Natural Heroes series. So, I mean, just the power of like a story like that. Right. And I think that the relationship that like Neil and I developed with Al, with our character, I think was a part of that and just made it feel really genuine, and it just connected with people,
Al, how do you feel about that? What was your experience like with Neil and Matt, and what are some memories that stand out as they were filming?
Well, one of the things that I think about is how in that film it's not only about environment, but it told the story of my life. It's from a young fella right on through, and different things that I did that had nothing to do with bluebirds or environment. It's just the story of my life. So I feel comfortable showing this to family members and environmental people. Before this film, I had a program that I would update from time to time, that I would take to schools and show school children and any other group that wanted to see it. And this film just takes the place of all that. It tells the story of the environment, tells the story of the bluebird's problem, and it tells my story of my life. Yeah. So I'm just happy about all that.
Again, this was great to catch up. And before we go, is there anything else too that either of you would like to share before we wrap up?
Like for me, one of the things that I think I learned from you, Al, and something that you talked about a lot when we would go out on the Bluebird Trail was this idea of like sticking with a project, sticking with an idea and following through on it. Right. And like, I mean, that's something that I struggle with. Right. I mean, as a filmmaker, it's like you produce this piece of content, you get it out into the world, and then we're eager to move on to the next thing. And sometimes, especially in the world of conservation, sometimes you just need to stick with it. Like Al, for 40 years, you monitored all of these Bluebird Next boxes. Like that's what it took, to have that impact. If you had done it for just 1 or 2 years and then quit, we wouldn't be here having this conversation. And all of these bluebirds wouldn't have had this positive impact, but also all of the folks that you mentored along the way, and all the folks that you inspired to do similar work. So, I mean, that's the piece of advice, Al, that you've given me that I have held on to and at least tried to incorporate into my own conservation work.
Well, again, it was wonderful to watch the film again after all these years. It still resonates. It will always resonate. And Al Larson, you are an inspiration, such a positive example of how one person really can make a huge difference. And, that is a question that we get so many times from audiences after these programs is, what can I do to help? How can I make a difference? And you have led the way by example. And so thank you for that. And Matt Podolsky, thank you so much for putting Al's story on film. Thank you both.
Okay, you're welcome.